I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is The Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration. All right, well, today I am speaking with Dr. Dean Abbott. And Dean, it is a pleasure to speak with you. We've had you on our Solid Ground live stream 3 times now, and I enjoy speaking with you. Yeah, we had one where we just talked with you, then you were on with us with Dr. Danny Sulikowski, listening to her thoughts on her mate suppression theory or reproduction suppression theory. And then we had a more recent one, and we were talking about relationship pessimism. And you work as a couples coach and among many things, yeah, writer and many other. And I'd love to maybe start off by having you tell me a little bit more about your background and how you got involved in doing this work.
Well, my background is very, it's been a winding road, let's say, right? So um, I started out academically very interested in philosophy. I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy and one in psychology. And kind of pursued an academic path for a long time and ended up doing my doctoral work in communication. And so I taught for a long time, and that kind of fell through as higher education itself is kind of in a massive reshuffling. And it was something I didn't feel like I wanted to pursue further. And so as I started to reflect about what was really important to me and what I really wanted to do, I've always been drawn to some sort of counseling, coaching, kind of work, a ministry to work. I'm, in addition to being a coach, I'm also a ordained chaplain, and I do some of that kind of work as well. And so I began to like look for a path toward that, and that was several years ago, and that I started looking for that. At the same time, it happened that I was tweeting a lot, and I started to get a lot of personal direct messages based on what I was writing about on Twitter, asking for advice. And it got to be quite a lot. And at that point, I thought, well, I should just make a way for people to talk to me directly using Zoom if they want to. I started out actually doing some of this for free. And and it just from there as I continued to meet with people and I saw how my approach, all of my background, my skills, all of that could actually help people in those conversations. I eventually just started to kind of grow it into a coaching business, and now I'm mostly coach men. I actually mostly do kind of self-development coaching for men, and occasionally I work with couples who are dealing with communication issues or whatever. But often I find that a lot of couples problems come down to a lack of the proper kind of mentoring and development on the man's part. And so a lot of the couples coaching I do is actually sort of self-development for the man who so that as he develops, he has a greater impact and a more positive impact on those people around him and the way his relationships are structured and function.
Yeah, so I like that description of the winding path, and it sounds like you have a lot of different educational and experiential elements that you're bringing together in the work that you're doing with people.
Yes, that's certainly true. Lots of experience in education, lots of experience in social services. All of that comes together in a way. In addition to all of my private studying and that kind of thing.
Well, how did you, and I know this might be like a huge question, but how did you come to see things the way that you do around men's responsibility?
Well, I think a couple of reasons. I think I just first of all just approached it philosophically. I've never been so let me say something about where I locate myself. I am not a red pill extremist. Uh, in fact, on Twitter, I've taken quite a bit of abuse for not being so, for being
Mm,
critical of that
mm,
that end of the spectrum. I also have never been particularly impressed or persuaded by a lot of the claims of liberal or kind of radical feminism.
mhm,
And so I find both of those to be unacceptable to me for their own reasons. And I think too, I have just always had a deep commitment to the family
mhm,
as a institution and very curious about what makes a family function.
mhm,
And so I think I kind of arrived at some of this philosophically and from my own observations of the relationships I've been in and the relationships I've seen. About probably close to 20 years ago now, I stumbled into the manosphere.
mm,
Uh, People kind of think of the manosphere as a recent development, but it's been around for a long time. And I remember probably 20 years ago, started to read a very popular manosphere blog at the time, written by an author who just called himself Royce,
mm.
Roissy.
Okay.
And it's very popular at the time. And while of course, I didn't endorse everything on that blog, I did spend quite a bit of time reading Manosphere material. And one of the things that they argued, I think very persuasively about, was sort of the effect of the man's role in a relationship, right? And it's funny because I later on I that's that a version of that conviction is borne out, and even in like the research by John Gottman, et cetera, that the man's attitude tends to set the spirit for the
Mhm,
family,
mhm,
and so it's been interesting to me to sort of trace that from the most extreme edges of the manosphere toward what is undeniably kind of mainstream research
mhm,
that men do have a very pronounced, if not outsized, influence in the family and the way that the family works. And his attitude and his approach kind of determines a lot. Now, that's not to say that women have no accountability or responsibility or any autonomy, but that his attitude sets the frame of a lot of the interaction in a family.
mm. And I know it's hard to speak, well, it's not hard to speak generally, but it's fraught, speaking in broad generalizations. But let's just put that aside for now and go with it because uh,
Sure.
there's lots of outliers, there's lots of variation, but there are these overarching themes that you see, and you're describing some trends and themes that you've witnessed and that research bears out and that you see over and over with people.
Right. And I also would say, it is, for example, on Twitter,
Mhm.
a good example. There are lots of people who just pretend they don't know how generalizations work, but they clearly do, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
everyone knows how generalizations work. And to sort of object to a generalization because you can think of a case in
Mhm.
which it might be not true,
Yeah.
I just don't find that a very useful or productive kind of conversation to engage in. So I'm happy to speak in generalizations and assume that everyone is able to understand what's happening.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like generalizations are part of the problem with things like, oh, critical race theory, for instance. You make these generalizations and then you want to apply it specifically to people's individual lives, but there is something useful in describing big
Sure.
forces and things that affect most people in certain ways.
Well, also generalizations can be true or false,
Mhm.
right? And so true generalizations are better than false generalizations,
Mhm.
and and true generalizations are better than false claims at the level of specifics.
Mhm.
And so I don't think that I think what matters about generalizations is not the question, is it a generalization, but is the question, is it true?
Mhm.
Right?
Well, it's interesting to me, and this might be a bit of a tangent, but you mentioned Twitter, and for years I wasn't on it. I didn't have a Twitter account for till 2023, 2022, I guess. It was around the time I put up the first video on this channel. I started a Twitter account, and at my husband's encouragement, actually. We weren't married yet. We'd just met, and he said, you should get on there. And I did, and you could see all these people from the university that I was speaking about
Ah,
talking about me and calling me white supremacist and all this stuff. So I could sort of see what the students were saying about my critiques of some of the education. But
let me break
yeah,
in here for just a
yeah,
second because I think this is helpful. And you're asking about my background,
yeah, okay.
especially, excuse me, especially, I think that I have a background that's much different from maybe from yours or from all the people who are with you often on the live stream. Is that I was never a liberal. I was never on the left at all.
Mhm,
Always very skeptical of that, and
mhm,
and actually quite apolitical most of my life.
mhm,
And and I and so I just I think when I listen to the live stream, for example,
mhm,
I hear a lot of people working their way out of a set of beliefs that they once took as normal.
mhm,
And I
mhm,
just never had that experience.
mhm, mhm.
And so when you ask about my background, uh, so it would
That's
never even,
important.
yeah, I would never even, it would never even occur to me to think in terms of critical race theory.
Yeah, for me, the way that I was introduced to those things was through education,
Hmm.
through undergrad, psychology major in undergrad, law school, and then later graduate school in applied psychology, so CMHC program that
Right.
I did in graduate school. And it was primarily that last chapter where I was confronted with these. I was not apolitical. I would say that I was definitely liberal. It's definitely on the left. Um, the thing that put me on the left was 9/11 and the American response and my horror at what the US was doing and what the George W. Bush, Dick Cheney,
Sure.
Halliburton, Rumsfeld stuff that I saw going on. I saw that as utter corruption and warmongering. And that was what put me on the left because I was opposed to whatever that was.
Hmm.
And so at that point, though, I was also a mom and I was a student and I was employed. And so I had a very, very busy life. So I wasn't super political. I wasn't really that politically active. It just sort of, just to kind of compare and contrast. My, I had a very shocking set of realizations because I'd worked in the medical field and took a lot of things for granted there.
Mm.
And then my daughter was vaccine injured in
Mm.
2008 or 9. And when I realized what had happened, it made me undo a lot of things. And that added, so I had the skepticism of right wing um, talking points, media, whatever, from I guess I was 24 in when 9/11 happened, something like that. So that pushed me left. And then when I had these realizations about how much propaganda there was in medical messaging and public health, that pushed me right because that was somehow a left-wing issue. And I landed in this place of deep skepticism about both. And so by the time I got to graduate school in 2019, and I've got this, you're supposed to feel really bad about your white privilege and this package of views on gender and sex that were so radically different than what I'd learned even in undergrad, because I graduated from undergrad in 2008. And I had taken a lot of psychology courses. So I'd taken psychology of gender, but it was a much more balanced thing. It didn't feel like it was a super feminist or gender ideologue sort of package that I was receiving there. It was more like, um, you know, here's some broad descriptions of how masculinity and femininity work in people's personalities, and some ways
Mhm.
that men are affected by things and women are affected by things. It didn't have that ring of ideology that it has now. So by the time I got up to 2019, got this in graduate school, and then COVID came along, and we got not only the leftist messaging from the schools, but also the public health authoritarianism coming through everywhere else. It's I guess I'm at a position where it's not so much a deprogramming myself from a set of received beliefs, but trying to figure out how to stand back and be as objective as I can as I look at what's happening. And so yeah, it's not as apolitical as what you're saying, but it's I think we're all shaped by these experiences. CRT I didn't know about until 2019.
But also, you're a millennial,
No, I'm Gen X.
are you?
Yeah, I'm almost 50.
Well, you're not. Okay, so you're a little bit younger than I am, but I think being Gen X, being right smack in the middle of Gen Xism, right where
Mhm,
I was born,
mhm,
I think throughout a lot of our developmental years, there was just a lot more room to not be a political extremist, right?
yeah,
There were places to anchor your identity that were not political.
absolutely.
And I think you see that like in a lot of the sort of Gen X media, what there was of it. This
Hmm.
is much less political. And, I think Generation X has always been characterized by a skepticism uh, of ideologies.
Hmm.
This is
Hmm.
why the most popular television program for a Generation X was called Friends, because that's the only thing you could trust. That
Hmm.
was the sort of underlying cultural message I think a lot of Gen X got, was that
Hmm.
all of that abstraction is dumb. And I think a lot of Gen Xers probably saw that a lot of the 60s ideology led to their not having stable families,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
became very suspicious of that, and tried to anchor our identities into other things like our friends, rather than sort of some kind of abstract social ideology about how we can make everything perfect.
Hmm. Hmm. That's interesting. That's an interesting observation. I think it is so kind of returning to the point about Twitter, and I'd love to see what you think about this. So I wasn't on it until 2022, late in the year.
Mhm.
And I have engaged with it fairly minimally
Mhm.
since then. Although at this point, I check it probably like once a day. I'll check and scroll and see what's going on. My impression of it prior to getting on it was that it's a very political space and a very argumentative space, and that the people who use it think that it's the world. They think that it is reflective of the real world. Although to people outside of it, they seem incredibly out of touch and in a bubble. And now that I'm on and I'm watching it and I'm observing it, I have pretty much the same perspective on it. There's a totalizing perspective that the posts in there. It's pretty much you can sum up most of them by we need to, and it's like all these thinkers who've figured out the answer, and they're going to tell you how to do it, and you're gonna start doing it. So it's a very preachy platform that I think the 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 mindset there as people engage with it more and more is they think that they're seeing the real world, but they're seeing something that's a very reductionist view of the world. And I wonder what you think as somebody who's been engaging with it for a while.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I've been on Twitter since I created a Twitter account in 2009.
Mhm,
And I didn't really start to use it until probably close to 2015. And in 2014, 2015, it was an entirely different kind of space.
mhm,
It evolves as time goes on, and especially as the algorithm changes.
mhm,
I think the last time I was on in the live stream, I was saying, the algorithms have made commentary cheap in the sense that you can say whatever you want and you'll experience no social friction. In
mhm,
fact, on Twitter, for example, the more inflammatory your commentary, the more you're rewarded. And so it's
mhm,
cheap in the sense that it costs you no social capital to say the most outrageous thing you can
mhm,
think of. And so, yes, people do get it's not by accident, it's they have a sense of reality that is curated by an algorithm
mhm,
that intentionally rewards that kind of totalization.
mhm,
Okay. And that part of the reason that I have often been frustrated with Twitter is that even on Twitter, I make an effort to speak with some nuance.
mhm,
And maybe this is something we talk about more is that there's almost none of that. That
mhm.
nuance now is kind of considered a waste of time. Or,
Well, honestly, it's a waste of, I feel that because I feel often I'll read something and I'll have a thought that's kind of like, well, yeah, but here and maybe, and I quite literally feel like it's a waste of my time. So I don't, I don't engage. I don't offer the nuance because it literally is a waste of your time.
to offer that nuance.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, I may that may be in terms of engaging, responding to
Hmm.
someone. Yeah, I don't do that. I don't respond to people much.
Hmm.
But in terms of the things that I write
Hmm.
and that come from me, that's an important value for me, right?
Hmm.
Um, and you get algorithmically punished for that to a certain degree. But I just think we've kind of developed a society in which people cannot think outside of bold, totalizing, declarative statements.
Yeah, exactly. I think that that speaks, I think that that resonates with my experience of that platform. It is
Mhm.
bold, totalizing, declarative statements. And that is why not only for responses, but also for maybe I'll see something thought-provoking and I'll think, oh, that's an interesting prompt. It makes me think all these things. Why would I take the time to write that out and share it there? Because it just goes nowhere. It's just what would be there are lots of feedback loops.
Mhm.
But I maybe we are getting off on a tangent, but it's just interesting how social media shapes a lot of the dialogues and thoughts and
Right.
reflections that people have.
That's very true. And also, as we talk about society, I think there are two things that get missed that are very important, almost always get missed. One is that human beings, as we experience them now in our society, have a very difficult time understanding anything that is not a bold, totalizing statement. Okay. Which I would distinguish from a generalization. Okay.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay.
And second, you've got to remember that I think 50% of the population, only 50% of the population can read above an eighth grade level.
Mhm.
There's these horrible statistics about American literacy. Jimmy Kimmel used to do this thing where he'd go out on on the street and ask people very obvious questions. Who is the vice president? Nobody knows. So I think almost when we talk about society, we almost never talk about the ignorance problem.
Mhm.
But so that when you hear people in debates, you have to remember there's a very good chance statistically that this person debating this cannot read above an eighth grade level. Now, Twitter's a little different because you can curate so finely who you follow. And that's part of the
Mhm.
reason I can still be on Twitter is that I'm very discriminating about the people I follow and I block quickly and easily.
Mhm.
And so that makes a big difference. But when I have some strange anon come into my my comments and want to debate me. I just don't.
Mhm, mhm. Well, it's been interesting to me to get a sampling of what people think and worry about and where anxieties go right now. And one of the big places, and it's something we've talked about in our previous conversations, is around gender
Mhm.
and, kind of coming full circle to what you were saying about what is a man's role in relationship. And there's a lot of relationship pessimism that you'll see expressed. Although recently the algorithm is feeding me a lot of really positive things. So I don't know, it just sort of goes in waves. Like right
Mhm.
now, it's a bunch of I've seen the sentiment expressed over and over that is really quite nice. It's men telling other men to take responsibility for their relationships and um, to look at what they can change and do differently in order to make a better. I don't know if it's just I liked a few comments and now I'm getting a ton of that, but it's very
Mhm.
positive masculine responsibility messaging. And I've
Uh-huh.
gotten lately, like this past week, a ton of anti-porn messaging coming through
Mm.
my Twitter, which I don't know if that's a global trend or if it's just my algorithm giving it to me,
Right.
but I appreciate seeing it.
I do think there are some realistic streams of that. I think the kind of the extreme gender stuff coming out of the far reaches of the red pill manosphere space. I think people have had enough of that, and that there's an ongoing pushback about that. And I think that there are just more moderate male voices I can think of on Twitter who are who understand the dynamics you're referring to there about, you know, you basically have to be a grown-up man.
Mm.
And a lot of what we've seen from the manosphere, red pill, incel crowd is often a just sort of a regurgitation of some kind of victim mentality that, women are all out there to take advantage of me and etc. And I think we are seeing some pushback against that victim mentality.
Well, one of the really interesting things, trends, not just on Twitter, but in culture, seems to be a rethinking of some of the wisdom or whether it was wise to go through the cultural change that we went through in the 60s and 70s with the sexual revolution. Like
Uh-huh.
we're rethinking that, looking at, okay, when we manipulated certain things and changed the way that people engage with sex and sexuality, how did that turn out for us? And how could we do that differently? And one of the best books on this that I've personally read was Louise Perry's book, The Case
Mhm.
Against the Sexual Revolution. I read that a couple of years ago, and I've been
Mhm.
thinking I should reread it because I really liked her thinking.
Yep. It's I'll say one thing about that.
Yeah.
I've read that book as well, and she's she struck me as exactly the person I'm talking about. This is the person who used to be on the left, who's
Mm,
very slowly kind of sort of sorting through a bunch of things. I don't know if you're familiar with Christine Imba's book about sex. It's sort of the same process.
it-
This person who's really been ensconced in mainstream, high status worlds where those beliefs are completely dominant.
what is the last name? Christine
Imba, EMBA.
EMBA. Yeah. As you say that, I'm thinking that perspective is a useful one because that is going to be the experience of a lot of young people because they're getting a very skewed and ideologically biased education right now. And
Hmm.
so there is going to be a lot of having to figure it out for oneself. And I think that that might be a reason that those sorts of arguments are important because it's a showing your work. It's a showing like we went from these assumptions and now we're opening up the perspective to bring in
Sure.
other thoughts. But something that and I'm interested in that. Thank you for the author's name. Um, I spoke with a woman named Darlene Lev.
Yes,
And maybe you caught the
I did.
interview that I did with her, and we had her on Solid Ground as well. And she's a professor and a really interesting person. And she's talking about her own experience as a woman who grew up during that time and was kind of as you're describing, somebody who grew up with a set of beliefs who then comes to question that set of beliefs and felt that looking back, she could see all the negative ways that her experience was shaped by that. But what I'm thinking, something that Louise Perry points out in her book is what a raw deal the sexual revolution has been for women on the whole.
Mhm.
And something I'm thinking as well is that it's been a raw deal for most men also.
Oh,
There is a set of men who have been the victors and the recipients of great success through the easier access to sexual relationships with women, but there's a giant set of men that have lost out massively, and most women have also lost out massively.
mhm.
So and that kind of goes into the Jordan Peterson discussion around enforced monogamy and what we lost when we stopped expecting people to just find a mate and stay true
Right.
to that mate.
Right. Mhm. Yes. And I understand that argument. And this is, again, this is a long time red pill trope, right? That 90% of the women are seeking 10% of the men,
Mhm.
the top 10%. And, you've got this top 10% of guys who are the ones who are pursued, and then the bottom 90 lose out. And I don't necessarily dispute that, but I would say I just point out like the materialistic assumption behind that.
Hmm.
And I mean, part of the biggest problem with the sexual revolution is that we reduced sexual activity to materialism,
Mhm.
to a materialist way. So that even if you are a guy who's out there and he can have sex with any woman he wants, right? This is still to ignore what that does to his soul
Mhm.
is still a way of just divorcing sexuality from any kind of meaning, right? And so that even when you have these ostensibly conservative people critiquing the sexual revolution, it's often done, remains within that kind of materialist frame
Mhm.
where we say, well, there's a small number of men who are victorious because of the sexual revolution. They're victorious
They're
only in the
getting
most
what they want, but they're not getting what's good for
good
them.
for them. Right.
Mhm.
Yes. They're only victorious in the most base and materialist way.
Mhm. I appreciate that clarification
Yeah.
and broadening of that frame. I watching I've been watching with my husband the series The Americans. I saw it a few years ago and I'm going back and rewatching it with
And
him.
that's about the Russian spies. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
yeah. I've
I think
seen
it's a
that
good
actually.
show. I
Huh?
enjoyed it the first time around and he's never seen it, so we're going through
Okay.
it. And in the second season, there's a KGB agent who is sleeping with an FBI agent and she's kind of playing double agent. She's sort of working both sides a little bit. And another KGB agent says to her, I read your reports and I know what's happening with the FBI agent. And there are parts of your body that were made for love. And if you use them in this way, it's at the
Mhm.
expense of your soul. And it's a bad paraphrase of what he says, but the way that he described that, it was like, wow, there's the moral heart of this conundrum. There's the
Mhm.
moral heart. And I think I know it's a pop culture reference, but I think it speaks to what you're describing.
Sure, it speaks to what I'm describing because what I'm describing is a universal phenomenon that people always intuit.
Hmm.
And some people that intuition is louder, and in some people it's quieter. But
Hmm.
but it haunts it's the ghost that haunts the revolution,
Hmm.
right? Because this is why people are sad. They're sad because something in them knows that this should be more.
Hmm. Hmm.
Hmm. And this, and here, okay. I don't know which way we want to go with this, but this is like an important part of what I'm trying to say about um about women. So you go where you want to go, but we'll see if we can bring it around to that.
Well, no, I'm curious to hear more. We can go in so many directions right now,
Well,
but a lot of them are kind of circling the
okay.
same themes.
So it is again a manosphere trope that women out there just want to hook up with a bunch of guys, as many guys as they can, until they hit they're close to hitting the wall, and they know their value is going to evaporate. So then they choose a beta man that they can settle down with, who they can dominate, and who will pay for everything.
Hmm.
Okay, that is the
That's the
sort of
cynical vision.
yes.
Hmm.
And just like everything else, it's a self-defensive, men who are hurt need this explanation. And that doesn't mean that I mean, there may be some truth to that in the terms of explaining some women's behavior, but it is also materialistic, right? In the sense that it denies the complexity of human beings. It's just like when I was in graduate school, and everything there was, of course, like you were describing, framed in a lens that took leftist ideas as obvious, right? Like, how would you? I mean, I used to say that diversity of thought in a lot of my graduate programs were, some Marxists think we should kill all the landlords, and some Marxists think we should only kill most of them. And they would say, "Oh, look, we have diversity of thought. This is a raging debate." And so part of the problem is that on both the left and the right, now we've come to a place where we deny the complexity of human beings. And there's a problem that I noticed too, just in a lot of social science, where they give a bunch of social scientists give a bunch of college freshmen a questionnaire, fill it out, and that's it. Now we know what the social truth is,
Hmm.
rather than understanding that human beings are complex and we all have competing desires. And we prioritize those desires often around our social programming and our social milieu, right? And so that, yes, there may be women out there who are in college and they are hooking up with lots of guys. The red pill incel cynical view is she's doing that because it's fun for her and she loves attention and she loves affirmation. And when she starts to know she's not going to get as much of that, she's going to settle down and choose a beta male, and that will be her life. But in fact, there's a much more complicated way to read that, which is she may not like it. Because a person chooses to engage in a behavior is not necessarily grounds for assuming that they like doing it. Then that may be especially true with women who tend to be higher in agreeableness, tend to have a higher level of value around social cohesion and those kinds of things. And so there's lots of reason to think that a woman might engage in those behaviors for reasons other than just she liked it.
Hmm.
So what I'm trying to say about the mm, materialistic point of view is that materialistic point of view supports a very simplistic view of the person. So that if you're willing to admit something like the soul, then you can say, oh, well, people do what they do at times, even at a cost to their soul.
Hmm.
Right? Because they're young, they're confused, they lack virtue, they haven't been formed correctly, they live in a largely degenerate and malformed society. And all of those things come together to shape people's behavior um, in a way that doesn't necessarily reveal the deepest longings of their heart. And this is also true for men, that men are also much more complicated than our discourse generally admits.
It's there's this YouTube channel called Soft White Underbelly. Maybe you
Uh-huh.
know it.
I've seen a couple of those briefly.
Yeah, I've seen a few of them, and they can be pretty hard to watch because they're
Mhm.
pretty gritty. I mean, it's the guy interviews people who often prostitutes or people whose lives have been really wrecked by drug addiction, things like that. But one of the things that I've heard in a couple of interviews with the prostitutes is this increasing cynicism about relationships based on their experiences. Like they have been um, used, they've used themselves, they've exploited themselves, and they've been used and exploited. So they've often got a pimp or somebody who's handling them who treats them like a means to an end. And then they have these sexual relationships that are often brief, often include um, mistreatment or stiffing them without paying them,
Mhm.
and often include married men. So they
Mhm.
know that the guy is married, or they see a car seat in the back of the car, stuff like that. And so after doing this for a while, they'll say, why would I ever want to be married? Why, I'm gonna use men for what I can get because they're not, there's, even if you do get married, he's just gonna cheat on you. And
Sure.
so there's this cynicism that develops, and it's this sort of vicious cycle here.
Mhm.
And I know that that represents an extreme picture because that's this even most of our, I don't know most, but a lot of the prostitution that we see right now is kind of sanitized in the form of vicarious experiences with, prostitute
Mhm.
acting, and then we call that porn.
Mhm.
And people consume, and I like that language because I think it's very telling. They consume
Mhm.
pornography. They don't view it, they consume it or they use it. So
Mhm.
it is prostitution. It's a thing that they're using. And the I I think so this is kind of scattered, but I'll throw this out there as well. I think that part of what creates it or is contributing to that cynicism among women about men is a persistent messaging that men are only capable of thinking on that base level, are selfish and are sex obsessed um, and unscrupulous around that. And I've always found that really disheartening. I think that when I was in my early 20s, I had a really good friend who spoke about men that way. And I was from a family with a really good father. I have a wonderful dad. He's one of my favorite people in the entire world. And I have two brothers, and my uncle was always kind of my hero. And I had read extensively. I mean, I had my nose in a book the whole time I was a kid. And so much of the literature I've read is written by men. And there's so much depth of feeling, so I'm not buying that men are just this like one-dimensional thing that can only think about sex and using you and is going to cheat on you. I can't buy that for a second. They're every bit as complex as anything that a woman is capable of, and more so in different ways and women are more so in other ways. But the depth of field there is incapable of reduction to that little point. But
Sure.
when you start to see people in that reduced way, you you lose faith in the
And
potential for connection, the potential for a valuable connection with another person.
yes, and so that reductionist point of view is default today. That our understanding of what the human being is so anemic that it leads to this sort of cynicism and about everything. And that the only way to challenge that society is to speak in a way that is cringe, right? I mean, this is my great defense of cringe is that I like to speak in ways that are cringe. I like to talk about the soul and the heart and about love because these are the things that make cynical people cringe, and they have to be normalized, right? They have to they have to, there has to be a language that is capable of carrying meaning at the level that the heart longs for it. And and in order to have that, a language capable of carrying meaning at the level that the heart longs to experience it, we have to um, use those words again, and we have to. maybe debate what they mean,
Mm.
but it's just interesting, I guess. My point is that we have this very cynical view of ourselves and other people, but we also have, and that's part of the way you navigate that cynical world is you worry about whether or not you're coming off as cringe,
Mm.
right? And so you have to adopt a persona that is constructed directly in the opposite direction of your deepest longings.
Mm. Well, and how much of this reductionism is inevitable and a direct result of the greater and shallower levels of communication we've achieved. I mean, we have it, to just flesh this idea out. The in the U.S., I don't know if it's most people, but many people don't live in large family groups. They don't live close to uncles, aunts, cousins, grandparents, their parents. We move all over. It's a huge landmass, and
Yeah.
people are incredibly nomadic and migratory. So we it's totally normal to be 45 years old and in a new city developing new friends, new friendships that aren't going to just necessarily aren't going to go back 25 years, aren't going to be 60 years long in their span.
Sure.
They're shallow, and that's the in-person experience. And then there's the online experience, which is even more so, where I can tell you I looked at Twitter this morning and I can sum up some of the themes that I saw there, but I don't remember necessarily who said what. And so it all becomes a massive blur. Oh, there were some people talking about this, there were some people talking about that, but it loses sight of the individual and it's just a little tiny snapshot. So we have this very broad and yet very shallow level of connection with a lot of the people in our lives in person and especially online. And so how much of this is just the human mind and social adaptation to that form of interpersonal connection?
You know, it's interesting. One of my theology professors used to make this point that social revolutions occur when a change in ideology is supported by an advance in technology, right? And so you have at one point an ideology that stresses the autonomous individual above all, right? That to be a full human being is to be free of obligation, especially familial obligation.
Mm-hmm.
And you now have the technology that makes it possible to be that person.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you're asking, you know, how do those things interplay?
Well, it's just, is it
I
inevitable that with this style
well,
of connection we have that
it's
we
not
would?
inevitable because there are
Mhm.
people who make choices not to do it.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, I live in Indiana, and 20 minutes that way is a bunch of Amish people who made a different choice.
Mhm.
Now, I don't want to be Amish, but a lot of people don't want to be Amish. But the
Yeah.
point is, it's not, and it only takes one case to show that it's not inevitable. That it is a matter of value,
I guess just going back to the generalizations, though, I mean, like
right?
the idea that most of us are engaging in these ways, and most of us are living far from our ancestral homeland. Like, I don't even know
Yes,
how many generations back I have to go to find something stable. Everybody
right,
moved everywhere.
right. So I'm not sure what you're asking me though. Are you asking, is that inevitable?
Is it inevitable that we will see greater relational cynicism and more reductionist thinking given the broad but shallow level of connection that most
I
people
think it's the other way
experience?
around.
Okay.
I think we have I think just historically we see the development of more and more sort of materialistic, reductionist, cynical views of the person, which then get normalized through our cultural institutions.
Mm.
And then and then when those ideas are motivating people, they look for opportunities. Obligations are necessary curtailments on your freedom.
Mhm.
okay, necessarily. Like
Limitations, yeah.
yeah. And so I think when you have a normalized cultural ideology that says obligations and limitations are bad, people will look for ways to escape those
hmm
regardless of what the level of technology is.
hmm
Okay?
hmm
Um, but this is something else that I wanted to talk about. It was just kind of talking about the way people think, and especially thinking about. So let me try to sum this up. What we've said is people have a very simplistic way of understanding themselves and other people. Part of the fallout of that is the disbursement of families, the breaking of social bonds. And part of the fallout of that is great unhappiness and relational cynicism. I think that's the track we're on. Going back to kind of the way that people have been conditioned to think is that no one now, almost no one, it seems to me, is able to think in terms of trade-offs. Thomas Sowell makes this point often, is that that everyone is in a sense a utopian.
hmm
Everyone is a optimist. I am not. I am a
hmm
pessimist. And what I mean, I am a hopeful pessimist. So I'm not a relational pessimist, right?
Hopeful pessimism.
So what I mean by that is that I don't believe that I am not triumphalist. I don't believe there is an ideology that could triumph over all opposing ideologies and bring the world into harmony. So this is the claim of all great totalizing ideologies is that whether that's Marxism, whether it's a kind of techno-utopianism, whether it was, a kind of Nazi ideology that somehow we could engineer a world in which there are no trade-offs and everything is works. And my understanding, in my view, is that no, will nothing, many things will never work,
hmm
right? And that what we have to do is to think about, okay, what's the cost and the benefit of this, and what are our values? So we will never have a world in which some people don't move far away from their families. Okay. So we have to think, okay, well, is that good or bad? Well, there are trade-offs. I live in rural Indiana. I mean, I could move, I suppose, to Seattle, right? Might be all kinds of opportunities for me in Seattle that that there aren't in small town rural Indiana. But I'm making a values-based decision about what the trade-offs of that would be. And I just don't think many people think in that kind of way now. We we are both in a way cynical and very naive about the possibilities of a kind of utopian world where if only women would learn to be serious and get married at 20, everything would be fine. You see that all over trad Twitter, right? Or if or whatever it is, if only such and such a group would do X, the world would be great. But and so we're very naive in that way, and also very cynical in another way. And I just think to counter that, we have to have a way of thinking in terms of trade-offs
hmm
and a way of thinking less like materialists.
Well, as somebody who got married at 19, I can tell you that didn't necessarily work out that well for me. But
Right.
I do think people are, I try to give people a lot of credit. And in my work with our peer support community, as well as with my one-on-one clients and families that I work with, I see a lot of that same kind of depth that I was speaking about when people say men are just this. Say
Mhm.
no, they're absolutely not. And I see the same with people in general. I think people do. I think that we get in our own way sometimes when we underestimate the negative aspects to that trade-off. where that our optimism or our hope for said outcome gets in the way and skews that. And I see that with all kinds of stuff, like, even just decisions that I've made where I'm like, what, something that I feel like I could look past this. Yeah, I see that downside, but I'm just going to overlook it because I see this upside. And then later on, you find yourself contending in a very real way with how do you manage that downside. And
Right.
not speaking to relationship issues necessarily, just decisions.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, and that's life,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people sort of don't seem to be willing to accept that.
Hmm.
I think too, in the end, here's what it comes down to. I think most people are alienated from their core desires. I think most people want two things. They want to have secure, ongoing love, and they want to love and be loved by a community, meaning a family and an extended group of people who know them, and they want to feel uh, sort of held and supported by that love. I think most people also want a way of creating or making something that gives them meaning. So, love and work is what people want. They want meaningful work, they want meaningful relationships. And that all this other stuff is kind of downstream from the frustration of those
Mm.
basic desires. And we've kind of come to a point where even to say these are my basic desires
Mm.
is cringe, right?
Right. I was thinking about the point you articulated about cringe and how there's these basic desires, as you say, and I would agree with what you're saying. But to the degree that a person feels afraid they can't achieve them, either because they're not achievable or because they are themselves somehow broken and unworthy, they
Mhm.
will start to protect themselves instead of going towards those things. And that's the
Right.
I don't want to be cringe. I don't want to be needy. I can't be vulnerable. I don't want to get hurt. And the
Mhm.
more we put up walls of defensiveness and protection around ourselves, the more we make ourselves unavailable for the very things that we want. And it's kind of a vicious cycle. It's a catch-22.
And so that happens on two levels, right? When you're a child, you have these needs and desires, or ultimate needs and desires are very often very pronounced to you, okay? But people are mean to you. Um, and you get beat up, you get abused, you get taken advantage of, and you start to get alienated from those things, either because you think that they don't exist, or you're not worthy of them, or something. So you develop, like you're talking about, kind of personal, emotional problems at that level. But that person is also living in a larger culture that's telling you those things aren't real. Or at the very least, you should live in ways that move you further away from those ultimate desires rather than closer to them.
Mhm.
And I just, if we're going to have any kind of cultural renaissance, which I'm not convinced we will, it would have to be how do we create a culture that allows people or encourages people to move back toward the fulfillment of those two basic desires instead of directing them away from them constantly.
Mhm. Well, and I think a lot of that involves undoing uh, much of the sexual abuse that's happened. And that,
For sure.
speaking of the sexual revolution and the materialism of casual sex being okay, pornography, gosh, little kids accessing that before they've ever had a chance to have a crush on somebody,
Right.
seeing pretty graphic stuff. Um, I wonder, and this is a maybe to sort of put a cap on the conversation. I've asked this question a bunch to people that I've spoken with over the last couple of years, since seeing how graduate students in counseling programs are taught about human sexuality, which is basically anything goes. anything at all, as long as you feel good about it and you had consent from anybody you did it with. Anything goes. That's what
Yeah.
counselors are being taught right now.
Uh-huh.
And I that strikes me as deeply wrong. But in a post-religious society, which we are, where we don't have there are a lot of religious people, but we don't have a societal consensus on a religious or spiritual foundation for our sexual morality. How do we articulate a positive vision of sexual morality that isn't this consent is king
Yeah.
kind of thing?
I
Well,
think you
so
just
what are your thoughts?
I think you ask, does this behavior lead me closer or further away from my desire for ongoing, lifelong, stable love in a community? And not all sexual behavior does. Some does, some doesn't, right? Sex that produces children tends to lead toward families. And it, and so, people have multiple reasons for engaging in the sexual behavior that they do. And I don't want to sound like I'm being harsh with people. I understand people are complicated and people um, have multiple motivations and people live in a culture, as you were saying. But I do think just people asking themselves, does this sexual behavior lead toward the long-term, stable, committed, communal kind of love that I want? Does that help me or hurt me in achieving that goal? I mean, and the big part of the problem we have now is that the normal, what is considered normal, is just you should have as much sexual experience of any kind that is appealing to you as possible because that is the definition of a good life. And that is not really in line with most people's most basic desires.
No, but it is in line with what you said about the obsession with removing limitations from everything. Because if you
Right.
remove limitations and obligation from everything, you're just a monkey playing with yourself at the end of the day. You know, what I mean,
Mhm.
you're just sitting there with ultimate leisure and self-gratification.
Right. Right. And that's ultimately unfulfilling for the heart,
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I think that's well articulated. Thanks for having this discussion with me. It's
I
really
hope it was
interesting.
useful for people who might listen. I feel like we covered a lot of territory and kind of rambled around a little bit, but I hope it's useful.
I think we did, but I think that was the interesting part for me anyway. I enjoyed just being able to hear your thoughts and bounce ideas off of you.
Sure. All right. Well,
Can
thank you. Anytime.
Yeah, tell people where they can find you.
DeanAbbott.com. I work with a coaching consortium, and they can find me there. It's at a life design /Dean. And on Twitter, I'm on at Dean Abbott all the time.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Dean. I
Sure.
really
It's
appreciate
fun.
it. Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
Bye bye.